Okay, good morning, everyone. It does sound a little odd for me to be saying good morning. We tried a change of time for our June Real Learners webinar this month around, and just to see if it helps. And we're always running little experiments like that here, just to see how we can assist people, how we can engage people a little more effectively along the track. And so I sit here this morning running a webinar, which is unusual for me, but I am sitting here. You might even hear me from time to time go to my to sip on my morning coffee. I'll concede that it's my second morning coffee. So welcome and thank you for giving up your time. I guess congratulations on giving up your time to put a little bit of effort into the future. I'm going to talk today about the notion of foresight. And we're one of the few small, actually, as people, the only species on the planet that's capable of foresight. Most other species will look very much for the immediate. They might learn some lessons from the past, but they're learning them only to serve them in the immediate short term. We're the ones that are capable of saying, you know what, I could be doing some work right now. I could be knuckling down and knocking off some of the tasks that are in my task list and feeling the satisfaction of having sent some more emails, or cleared out that post-it note that I've been leaving on the desktop of my laptop. But you have been people who've decided, you know what, I need to plan. I need to put some time aside to learn about how I can be agile and how I can be adaptive and how I can make sure that I future-proof not only my people, which is obviously what this webinar is about, but how I can, through future-proofing my people, future-proof my business or my team or my organisation. It's a funny concept, isn't it? The whole notion of proofing, of future-proofing, and we usually associate proofing with disaster. So we want to proof ourselves. We want to be fireproof, for instance, or we want to be flood-proof, or we want to be bomb-proof. And while we're not talking here about proofing ourselves for a disaster, the future is not a pending disaster. And we're probably not going to prepare ourselves adequately if we consider it that way. But what we do know is that that these days, with the rapid pace of change, that the future is going to strike us unexpectedly. So some of the changes that we're going to face are going to come out of nowhere at us, in much the same way that the changes associated with disaster, like fire and flood and bombs, come at us out of nowhere. And what's interesting to know from a human affect or a human feeling or a human condition kind of perspective is that when something comes at us out of nowhere, it triggers one of what's often referred to as 9 innate affects in us, or 9 innate feelings. 6 of the feelings that we can experience tend to be different negative kinds of feelings. 2 of them are positive, and I won't go into all those different 8 ones, but there's one that's neutral, and that neither feels good nor bad. It's just a surprise. It's often referred to by behavioural scientists as being the startle affect. And it's the sort of affect that we experience when there's a clap of thunder or a gunshot in the distance. And it means that whatever you're paying attention to right now is disrupted. And you have no choice but to turn your attention very quickly to what has suddenly become aware to you and is suddenly a part of your life. It doesn't last forever, but it's a feeling that's neither positive nor negative, but it's quite startling, and it draws your attention to it. And I think that's how the future is going to land in our laps. I think that some of the changes that we've been talking about as being potentials of the future for quite some time now. We've talked before about things, like self-driving cars and artificial intelligence and those kinds of developments associated with what's now become the catchy headline of the rise of the machines. And we've talked about those things for a while now, but they're on our doorstep. So there's a wonderful clip that you can go and look at even around the self-driving car concept of the Budweiser beer company in the United States that has already been able to deliver large shipments of beer in semi-trailer style trucks in self-driving vehicles without there being any risk to the public or to their own business as well. So it's right on our doorstep, and it's going to land in a hurry. And for a moment, we're going to feel startled by it. Now, the people who are going to be less startled by it are those who have prepared. And I think that the greatest preparation that we can do is very much an educative pursuit. So it's about being educatively prepared such that we have agility in the way that we work. It was Malcolm X who said that education is the passport for the future. for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. So what we need to do is to understand what is the educative imperative, what is the learning imperative involved in our people being able to respond to with agility to the changes that are coming when that startle moment arrives. So what we're looking for is not for people who go, oh boy, this is awful, we can't cope, and look backwards for solutions. We need people who actually, you know what, in terms of the fireproofing, we need people who actually built their fire breaks. In terms of flooding, we need people who put the sandbags up. And in terms of bombs, we need people who built the bomb shelters. We need those kinds of thinkers and those kinds of preparers in your business if you are indeed going to be able to genuinely future-proof them. So it's a lot. It's a big deal to try and cover all of that. So I want to acknowledge, I guess, first of all, that fitting all of that in is going to be one hell of a challenge today. And so as a result, it may feel a little bit like we're sort of, it's all a blur and you're racing really fast past some very important concepts today, and perhaps even some broad concepts today. I'm certainly someone that has a tendency to work more towards the specific, but sometimes we really do need to stop and to think broadly about whether we're steering our ship in the correct direction. And so it may feel that we're going very quickly today. I'm going to give you some opportunities at the end of the webinar today to be able to step further into that with us if that's something you'd like to do, and also just to be able to access some further information yourself. I've got some recommendations that you might like to take up that don't even involve us working together, but that you might like to grab and to take advantage of, because I do want to acknowledge that I'm talking today broadly about a skill imperative, and you'll notice, and I'm going to speak in a minute about that not being a knowledge imperative, but building 10 skills as a result of sitting down for one webinar in your people is probably an unrealistic expectation. It can be done, but it'll take more than just the awareness that I'm looking to bring to you today. And I guess that what that means is thinking about us as tomorrow's learner. You know, what would it mean first of all in terms of not just future-proofing my people, but future-proofing myself to be able to do some fantastic stuff with my team. And I think I love even just the little acronym, the initials out of tomorrow's learner. It reminds me that what we actually need to do to be tomorrow's learner is to be a thought leader, you know, TLTL. And to be a thought leader, I think that what means is that we need to be determined to work in the interface between now and tomorrow. We need to be determined to work in the interface between people and the machines. So what that means quite fundamentally is that we need to be determined to unlearn knowledge and to learn skills. It was Alvin Toffler who said that the illiterate of the 21st century won't be those who can't read and write. It'll be those who can't learn something, unlearn it, and then relearn a completely new way of doing things. And what we know about the future is that knowledge is dead. Knowledge was broken about 30 years ago with the invention of the internet. The internet made knowledge accessible to everybody, and we know this. I guess if you're like me and you go back 30 years, you're sort of delving into something of a childhood. And I remember being a kid at school, and the work that we were asked to do was very much around knowledge, and we had to go and find knowledge, and we only had a single source. It was Mum and Dad's wonderful Funk and Wagnall's encyclopedia that they had saved scrupulously to be able to place in our lounge room, and it was a very honourable thing that they did, knowing that how important in that era knowledge was. And so we went to that source whenever we needed to do a project at school, whenever we had an assignment, whenever we had some homework. We sat in the lounge room, we thought about what the key topic was, we looked up which volume of the encyclopedia alphabetically we would need to extract, and we found the knowledge we were looking for, and we picked up that knowledge and we dropped it into our projects. So single source of knowledge. Sometimes there were some ancillary sources. We might ask some questions of Mum and Dad. I often refer to myself in my house as being human Google, because I feel like I get hit with so many questions by my teenagers at school. And we may, duck down to the library to look for some other information, or find a project pack from a bookshop. But there was very few options for us to be able to access that knowledge. The internet broke that concept, because, as you know now, any reasonably broad search that you were to drop into Google will result in millions and millions of potential pieces of information that you would need to access. And so knowledge doesn't matter anymore. Finding knowledge doesn't matter anymore. Having the skill to be able to determine what of that knowledge is particularly useful is really important these days. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes in a little more detail. I think that the notion of virtual reality is a fabulous example of that, about that working in the interface. It's not just about the technology, but it's about the way that human beings interact with that technology that makes virtual reality such an impressive skill and such a wonderful potential for us in the future. And that's the little thinking space that I want us to work in. So if I'm going to be really honest today also about what do tomorrow's learners do, they're participants. So I really would love to encourage you today to be a participant in your own learning. So I do want to encourage you to get involved in the webinar today, and there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can, if you look on your control panel, you can see that there's the option for you to be able to put your hand up. And I guess that's one of the things that hasn't changed about the learning environment in the old classroom, that you do have the function to be able to put your hand up today and to be able to interact with us. I can see a couple of new people on the attendee list today, and I can see a couple of familiar names as well. And I'd love to hear from you if you think that you can contribute in some way. I think that when it comes to effective learning, that if you have a question about how this can be contextualized in your organization or in your work, it's probably of value to other people as well. So don't let me just deliver information today. If you feel that you can play a part, then I would love to have you involved. Now, if you're a little shy about me unmuting you and hearing your voice, you can default to the question section or the chat box, depending on the version of control panel of GoToWebinar that you have installed on your laptop. So I would suggest go to the question section if you have something that you'd like to add. I'll check on it periodically through the webinar today. And I think that if you were able to make a contribution in that way, I would very much like to be able to try and answer your questions as we move forward. So let's get started. What I've done today is I've pulled together what for me is 10 skills that I think sit most neatly behind the ability to be able to future-proof your people. And like I said, I think for me, I view it as a bottom-up opportunity, which is what I'm talking about here is by changing your people. And I'm often, when I'm talking about change with organisations, talking about the fact that teams don't change, people do. And so what I'm talking about here is by changing the people and changing their skills, not their knowledge, their skills. What I think that we can do is to be able to move up to organisations that change as a result of the individual shifts that happen. And the first skill I want to encourage you around is that the ability of your people to collaborate, the ability of your people to cooperate, and their ability to be able to work together to solve problems is going to be central to their ability, to your organisation's ability to remain agile and to remain future-proofed. I think that the age of the lone genius is over. I think that people who sit at the top of organisations and dictate to the below what's going to happen, and because they've got the vision for the organisation and they know what the direction is that the organisation's headed in, and everybody else's role is just to row the boat in that direction, I think that age is over. I think there are examples of that everywhere that are emerging these days. If you look at Steve Jobs and Apple, or if you look at Branson and Virgin, or you look at Elon Musk and Tesla, they have a vision for the organisation, sure, but what they know is that part of their vision needs to be the enabling of their people to solve big problems together. So part of what Musk talks about is that he believes that part of his role is to put problems in front of his people that he has absolutely no idea how to solve. He just thinks that they're useful problems to solve. So their ability to work together to solve those problems doesn't come from genius at the top. It comes from the conditions that have been put in place for them to do awesome stuff together. My belief is that really effective collaboration, really effective cooperative learning is dependent on 4 principles. First of all, teams work really well together if you can manage the numbers in the team. So even if there's a large project that needs to be tackled, if you can compartmentalise that down to having people tackling tasks within that project in smaller groups, then I think that's an effective thing to do. A really clever cooperative learning guru called Spencer Kagan spoke to the fact that the most effective number for people to work in a team is 4. But he did also remind us that without good structure and good habits for the way that people work together, that the human element will take over, even in a group of 4. And we'll have one hog who says, great, group tasks, I love those, it's my time to shine. You'll have one log who says, great, group tasks, it's my time to do completely bugger all. And then you will have a couple of people who remain mildly annoyed with both the hog and the log, who are stuck in limbo and not particularly doing anything apart from being really annoyed. So the notion, first of all, the first principle behind really clever cooperative / collaborative learning is interdependence, which means that any task that we tackle as a group, we must need each other to get that task done. We must have roles clearly defined. The second principle we talk about is accountability, which is about making sure that everybody, again, it's about the task not being able to be completed without all of us doing our bit. And so it needs to be really clearly defined who's got what job, and that we don't have passengers in the way that we're taking on group tasks. The third principle we talk about is work, think, sharing, which is really about making sure that our division of labour is being defined. So I think when most people come into a group task or a group activity, we work out what's going to be the outcome that we're going to strive towards, and our hog assumes a position of leadership, and our log assumes a position that's far more passive in the way that they're going to participate. And we hope that somehow we will get there equally. In the end, people get really annoyed when people aren't pulling their weight. So it's really important that the human element is removed from the ability to access the neocortex of your brain by making sure that everybody's got a reasonable division of labour. So when it comes to work and when it comes to thinking, we need to make sure that we are sharing the labour in that regard. And then we want to refer to what we call simultaneous interaction as the fourth principle, which is making sure that, I guess, one of the traps of working in teams is that we take turns. And that means that at any particular time, even in a group of 4, 75% of people are waiting for their turn to do something. And that's no good, because what we know about engagement in the workplace, and if I often, even in a learning environment, refer to engagement as people who are listening, speaking, thinking, or doing. So even when I'm running a keynote or I'm delivering a workshop, I am utterly determined that no one will passively or actively disengage, because I know that when people wait for their turn, they don't listen, speak, think, or do. And in fact, I think if you think about our own psychology, about when we go to a doctor, what we do know is when we land in that waiting room and we look down at the table and we see the new idea from 2000, from perhaps maybe 2003, we notice that the television's broken and there's really nothing there to entertain us. I wonder if you're like me, in possibly within 10 seconds pulling your phone out of your pocket and finding something to do on that. Waiting is something that we have become increasingly poor at, and we will find a replacement for that. What we don't want in the learning environment, in the collaborative environment, is for people to wait, because they'll find a replacement for the task that we want them to be able to tackle at the same time. So 4 key principles there around interdependence, accountability, work, think, sharing, and simultaneous interaction that we need to bring into the notion of being able to collaborate and cooperate effectively together. The second skill I want to talk about today is discrimination. I know that there's a fabulous report that I'm often referring to. It was done by the Institute for the Future out of the University of Phoenix, and they talked about the work skills of the future, and they probably put it more eloquently than me when they say that there's a skill that goes beyond knowledge, which is cognitive load management, and they believe that, effectively for me, I think this is the ability to discriminate. And I'm often talking to a wonderful theorist called Benjamin Bloom, who developed way back in the 50s his first incarnation of what he called Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom pointed out that most of our work tends to be in the knowledge and comprehension space. We do it in schools. We encourage kids to know this and then to regurgitate it on a test, but it doesn't require much higher order thinking. It doesn't require them to do things like discriminate what's useful. And if you think about what we need to do these days when we look at a Google search, so when we do seek knowledge or we seek information, we pump in a generic term, and then what returns to us is millions and millions of potential possibilities. And what we need to understand is that the first handful of those are most likely being paid for. We need to also understand that of the next 20 on that list, that they're probably not relevant. They've been developed by somebody who's completely outside of your context. And so the skill is being able to look through those first 25 or so potential search results, and to be able to, if I may speak plainly, look at each of them and just go rubbish, 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 rubbish. Ah, hang on, that might be useful. And to discriminate between useful and useless information is extremely difficult, is an extremely important skill for people to have. So it may sound awful that we're encouraging people to discriminate. We're not asking them to do this discrimination thing amongst themselves in terms of people, but we're asking them to discriminate when it comes to knowledge. It's time to not accept every piece of knowledge that's been provided for us. Indeed, we probably have examples in the media everywhere about how we should not be trusting the information to us just because it's been delivered. It's time to question, it's time to discriminate, and it's time to make sure that our people are understanding that finding knowledge is a low-level skill, discriminating, working out what's useful, and working out also, as a result, what's useless, is the kind of skill that they genuinely need to be able to move forward. Future skill 3 I'd like to talk about is composition. I love the note, and I guess the truth is here what I'm talking about is creativity, but I love the imagery that the word composition or composing conjures for me. I think that what we want is people who can be artful in the way that they work. We want our workers to consider themselves as artists in the way that they tackle their task. We don't want them to think that the job of a task is to go and find out a bit of information or to create something that's already been created before. Composition is not about copycatting. And we see even in the music industry, when we want people to compose, there's people out there who are doing mashups of various songs and bringing them together, but the ones that actually take off are the ones that have a really unique and new and creative bent on them. But the truth is, what really captures our ear when it comes to great composers of music is something new, something that really stands out. And that's what we want our people to seek. A really clever fellow called Ken Robinson speaks to, as that many of you will be very familiar with, speaks to the notion that he believes schools are killing creativity because we're not asking kids to compose things these days. What's wonderful about kids is that they're dying to compose. So when I work with schools, and I still do and very much enjoy it, I was with a couple of schools in the last few days in both Darwin and in Canberra, and we were asking Year 6 students at school to compose raps that would convince people that they need to do certain things, such as to quit smoking or to end racism. And wow, they are extraordinary at it. And at some stage, our ability to compose disappears between about the age of 11 and when we enter the full-time workforce and we start to copy far more well-worn patterns. What we need people to do is, instead of following well-worn paths, is to take the machete out and create new ones. And that involves looking for new tools. It involves, so we don't need to just use the keyboard. We can use a synthesizer. We can use, all sorts of online platforms to be able to mix our music and create that unique sound that we're looking for. But what we know about businesses that do well is that they're the ones that disrupt, rather than sustain. They do things differently, rather than doing them a little bit better than they have been done in the past. And that's a hugely important skill, a hugely important imperative for us to take on. For us as leaders, I think that the work that's involved here is a little ethereal. It's really just saying, okay, can we put that lens over our, when we're viewing our people, when we're viewing our team members, can we put that lens over the top of the way we see them work and say, are we asking them to compose, or are we asking them to regurgitate and to repeat, to replicate? They're lower order skills, as Benjamin Bloom would call them. The skill of composing is right at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. This is higher order stuff, and this is where really fantastic things are done. Can we put that lens on? Can we see our people? Can we see our team members? Can we see our workers not as workers, but can we see them as composers, and then wonder what it is that they might compose? I remember myself working as a school principal, and I it was an amazing experience to open a brand new school as its principal, because there's so much design that needs to be done, so much composition. And I remember one of the real challenges we faced was that, being a government school, there were certainly a lot of delays around infrastructure, and it was a very rushed, last minute job to get the school opened on time. We were actually handed the keys to the school 2 days before the students arrived, which was pretty rough. You know, a lot of furniture just wrapped up in plastic. We had, you know, grass barely laid in the school, no playground equipment, no lines on any basketball courts. There was a lot of challenges when you've only got 48 hours before the kids arrive to actually get in there and set the school up. I remember there were 4 key principles that I needed involved in the school, and there were some approaches and programs that I won't bother you with now. But my 2 prep teachers, who were going to take on all of the 5-year-olds, walked into me and said, "So what do we do over the next 2 days to get ready?" And I said, "Look, I don't know." I said, "These are the 4 things that I need in place, and where you put furniture, how you set up the learning environment, where you deliver from is kind of up to you if you put these 4 things in place." Now, in my head, I had an idea of what that should look like. You know, I was the leader. I had a rough vision for where this was going to go. What I saw when I walked into that classroom on the Monday morning was exceedingly different from what I had as in my head as the vision for that learning space. It was so much better than what I had in my head. And what it was because I didn't just give them instruction, I gave them license to compose. And they composed something that was not only brilliant for them, but was replicable for the other people in our organisation. As leaders, we need to see our people as composers, and then occasionally we need to get the hell out of the way so that they can do that wonderful composition work. Future skill 4 that they're going to need is humanity. And I guess this is where we understand that and when I talk about that working in the interface between people and the machines, I think we need to acknowledge what it is that machines are likely to be incapable of doing. And what it is the humanness stuff. It's the stuff of being able to make us feel that we're being cared for by another of our own kind, that machines are not really going to be capable of being able to do. I think there's already examples here of industries that probably through accidents of design that are in that humanness area, they're the ones that are going to be well positioned to do well and to thrive and to grow into the future. I think if you think about the childcare industry, we're not going to be comfortable dropping our kids off in a childcare centre that's been manned by artificial intelligence and robots. We're also not going to be comfortable dropping our elderly into an aged care facility where they're being looked after by robots. So businesses within those 2 industries who understand that if they can do the humanness better, and both industries have challenges around that because humanness is an inherently flawed concept. We have some people out there who test our faith in humanity every single day through the deplorable, sometimes, actions that they take. But industries and businesses that can earn trust through great humanness are the ones that are going to be able to distinguish themselves. I talk in the education space to the rise of MOOCs, the massive open online courses that many universities around the world have launched as a way of being able to access a broader customer base. So instead of people being able to, having to be in a particular city to attend that university, or universities that organise these big open online platforms can access people from all over the world. And that's been an incredible money spinner for some of them. But what they have found is that the dropout rates in these massive online courses in a lot of places are now getting up around the 80 to 90% rate. People are not completing these courses. And why is it? We learn best in the company of other people, in the company of other humans. And organisations and businesses that are building in human element and human contact into their online courses are the ones that are getting a much higher completion rate, which is hugely important. So I think that it's really important. This is why I'm drawn so strongly to this notion of working in the interface between people and technology, between people and the machines, and encouraging you to say, okay, how is it that I can provide a human service that could be enhanced rather than driven by the technology that's available to me? There's a wonderful little clip I want to share with you now that I think demonstrates that just beautifully.
had some friends who have also got a vision difference child who was actually making these arms at the time. He offered to make Thomas Buzz Lightyear arm, and when he got the Buzz Lightyear arm, he was absolutely over the moon. And I just thought, I want to do
Powerful little clip, and what a brave little fellow as well. I think that one of the things that this emphasises for us, I think, is that we're at a very interesting little tipping point here. And I think that in terms of that humanness, that for our organisations and our businesses, I think that we're now, the imperative is to develop new ways of making people's lives better. And I think that that has gone ahead of even the notion of saving lives. I think that what we need to understand is that we may find a cure for cancer, but what that means is we're going to have a huge amount of people who stay on the planet longer. And every one of us who's on the planet has problems. Some of them aren't as big as being born without a forearm, but the solutions for all of the problems that an increasing population and an aging population is going to have are all going to be about making our lives better. I think that once some of the big diseases have been resolved, I think that our quest to stay on the planet longer is going to be replaced by a quest to have a more quality life while we're on the planet. And I think that if we're able to think about that in terms of our business and organisation as saying, okay, the imperative here is to make people's lives just so much better, to transform the way that they can interact through new inventions, then I think that you're probably on the right track in terms of future-proofing. I'd like to suggest too that there's a handful here that are very much inspired by that report that I spoke to before from the Institute for the Future in Phoenix, and they speak to the notion of new media literacy as being an important future skill. For me, I looked into what does that mean for me, and I think that the word that sits behind this is perception. And what it means is that we're looking for people in our organisation who can who can not only create new things, but can think about the way that that's going to be viewed, the way that that's going to be spun, the way that that's going to be criticised when it gets out there into the wide variety of different media outlets and capabilities that people have. So it's understanding the way that it could be seen, not just the way that it is. So we need to understand that we might be able to create something that's fantastic, but it's going to be viewed as something that's completely different. I think that politically there's been plenty of examples that we can look at where, we've known for some time in Australia that the advancement of our workplace relations and our manufacture, we've seen examples of manufacturing in Australia has struggled over the last few years, and many manufacturing pursuits have been closed down, such as the motor vehicle industry. And I think part of that is because every time we've tried to change anything around workplace relations, and you even look at the various battles between governments and unions, and way back to John Howard's work choices endeavours that failed miserably because they weren't able to be presented in such a way that people went, that's a good idea. So people's ability to be able to not only create new things, but to be able to present it in such a way, in a variety of media, through a variety of media, that allows people to go, actually, I reckon that's a good idea, is what we're looking to do when it comes to being media literate. Workplace skill, future skill 6 is around cultural competence, and this is, I love this picture. It's Gamcheon Village in South Korea, and it reminds me that there are pockets of culture, not just generic labels for culture. We shouldn't describe the South Korean people as being people who live in colourful houses. But this village in South Korea has taken on the imperative of building a culture built on colour. And what we know about culture, for me, is that it's just a set of behaviours. For me, culture is a set of behaviours that we encourage and that we tolerate. And when those behaviours become normalised, and this would have started with just 2 or 3 houses who decided to go colourful, and then it became that behaviour of choosing a colourful house became normalised in this village, and before you know it, you've got something that's become a cultural norm for that space. what we need to understand about culture is that we're becoming increasingly global in our culture. So in a global economy, what we want people to do, I guess, is to be able to question thinking globally, but acting locally. I actually think that's probably less relevant now than it's ever been. We need to think globally and we need to act globally. And we need to think about whether just because a behaviour or a pattern or a process has been normalised in our business, whether that will be accepted, whether that will be seen as a good idea in other cultures who might access your work. A good friend of mine has worked in public relations for many, many years, and he's worked in government public relations, so he's been helping a political party and a major political party to be able to understand the way that they're being presented in the media. And you can imagine, particularly at election times, that becomes an all-encompassing piece of work for him. And he's taken the skills, what he's done there is taken the skills that he's learned in terms of the way that messages are delivered in both a local and a global perspective. And he's now left that work and has started his own business working in being able to help other businesses to be able to make sure that their messages are acceptable in our country. In particular, he works with China. So he helps the Chinese businesses who are looking to invest in Australia and looking to grow their businesses and their investments into Australia to be able to deliver messages that are palatable in Australia that wouldn't be palatable in China. And the other way around. He's looking to have them, they build, for instance, press releases that they want to put out in Australia. They send them to him and he looks at it and goes, yeah, that might fly in China, but not in Australia, and says that needs to be worded completely differently. This is an organisation that these are organisations that trust him implicitly. They don't question his abilities because he understands cultural competence better than them. They're Chinese. They know the culture intricately that they live in, but not outside. So what we need to do is either build up our ability to understand the way that certain messages will be received outside our own culture, or we need to access and trust some people who have that capability. Hugely important from a growth perspective when it comes to global economy. I'm noticing in the attendee list that I've got Gihan online today, and I know that Gihan, as a futurist, speaks very passionately to the notion of transdisciplinarity. So I can't even spit the word out. And I know that his take on transdisciplinarity is understanding the way that various concepts will be understood, not only within your particular component of an organisation, but outside and into other components of the organisation. So for me, this reminds me of the amazing, of some amazing work that's been done by people around systems thinking. I think of people like Ari de Hoos, who've spoken to the notion of systems thinking versus siloed thinking. And for me, what transdisciplinarity means is that do people understand impact? Do they understand the way that their ideas, the way that their work, the way that their products, the way that their outputs can not only be seen from their perspective, but do they understand what the impact of it will be organisationally and in terms of market as well? I go back to, I guess my examples often come from my time as a school leader. And I know that people would come to me as a school leader, as a principal, and ask me for certain things that would make their work easier. And what I struggled with was the inability of people often to be able to see the way that if I said yes to them and I invested, for instance, the school's resources in buying them more resources, so if I caved into Karen, who Karen was often telling me that they didn't have enough readers in year one, and she would come up to my office with passionate stories about how kids were having to look over each other's shoulders to be able to see the readers, and I used to sometimes wonder why we had a concept called shared reading if nobody shared. But I used to think, wow, it's a good story, and I really felt like reaching for the checkbook and handing that resource because it would make Karen's problem go away. But what it meant was that I would have less resource to be able to attach to other priorities in the school. And what people who come to you wanting to take on a certain piece of work or make a certain change in an organisation fail to do sometimes is to understand impact across the organisation. That's what we would call siloed thinking as opposed to systems thinking. So hugely important that we encourage people to think a little bit about impact. This can come all the way down to behaviour and the way that we conduct ourselves in the workplace. We want people who have a level of empathy in our organisations. Now, not only empathy is empathy alone when it comes to that notion of humanness that I mentioned as future skill number 4. not only is empathy incredibly useful for people in the workplace, but it's also something that we know it's useful in terms of the way that they function together. So asking people if they understand the impact of the way conducting themselves in a meeting, how that might be played against how people might have perceived that, is a useful way to get people to reflect on their own conduct. I know that I've had people before that have, in a meeting, come across as very arrogant. Now, we know that if I talk to them about their arrogance and say, I need you to drop the arrogance, that I'm likely to get an argument. But if I speak to that person from a strength perspective and ask them to think about, who they, what sort of person they think they are, if I say to them, I see you as a really confident person, they usually agree. Yep. And then I ask them to think about, how do you think confidence could sometimes be perceived by others? And I say, I guess I could come across as being a bit arrogant sometimes. Now we're talking. Now we're talking in terms of their ability to understand the impact of their behaviour across a team. And we can address that now because we've taken the personal offence out of it. So transdisciplinarity is about removing the barriers that allow us to think only about ourselves, that allow us to operate selfishly, and being able to understand the way that our behaviour and our work impacts across a variety of different disciplines. Hypothesizing for me is future skill 8. It's the ability to predict. I think that one of the most important things we need to understand is that a lot of what we're going to do in the future is going to fail. And we need to get comfortable with that because, to be really honest, we also, one of the characteristics, I mentioned empathy before, but what we also want people to do is to be able to be resilient. And the ability to be resilient is reliant on failure. You can't learn how to be resilient by reading the book on resilience. My definition of resilience is the ability to thrive despite risk. And that means that we need people who can have obstacles in their way and can have the attitudes of being able to get through or get around those obstacles. They understand that those who are successful persevere. And they also understand that the nature of most struggles are temporary. And you only learn the temporary nature of struggles when you struggle through them, when you get past them. You can't read the book on empathy. You can't have the speaker come in and talk to you about about resilience. You can't, run a resilience program on a Wednesday evening and expect that people are now resilient. They have to experience risk. They have to experience difficulty. They have to experience failure. And in any organisation, we need to get people who are more comfortable with failure, because only when they are comfortable with failure will they do the top of bloom stuff of really creating and composing some fantastic, potentially transformational new products. Predicting is as simple as being able to say, I reckon. So, can we start some of our meetings by asking people to complete the I reckon conversation? I reckon that people out there will spend this amount of money on this product that will do this for their lives. And ask ourselves, does it stack up? Can we look at that hypothesis and say, actually, yeah, I reckon this is worth doing? Or do we look at that hypothesis and say, no, this is not worth doing. It's not going to fly. Or do we have a twist that we need to make on that? Do we have a little change on which we would need to make on that in order for it to click, in order for us to be able to move forward? So again, this is emphasising to us that what we need to do is to be able to be able to take risks in the way that we work. And what it's also emphasising is our ability to use foresight. I mentioned before that notion of foresight. There are only two capabilities that the human brain has that no other animal on the planet is capable of doing. One's foresight. It's the ability to look into the future. You used some today. You decided to put an hour of your time aside when you could be, getting some work done. And you chose to put a bit of time into the future capability of your organisation. So well done, congratulations. You're good at foresight. And we need to have people in our organisations who also look well into the future. It's risky because a lot of your predictions will fail. I know that in my work that 50%, that my target is that 50% of what I try to create for the markets that I access, both in the education and the corporate space, is determined to fail. It's going to fail. And I need to get comfortable with that, because otherwise I will start to create only safe stuff that doesn't really do anything particularly transformational or particularly wonderful for my business. And the other skill that I mentioned before is insight. And that's the ability to reflect on our own work. Now, my firm belief is that if you're going to reflect, if you want to have people in your organisation who reflect, then you better get them to reflect on something. There's nothing more useless. I ran a workshop yesterday, and there would be nothing more useless for me than reflecting on nothing when I got out to my car. I have a 10-second rule that I have to reflect when I get to my car. How'd I go today? But how'd I go today is so broad and vague that it doesn't drive action. So I can get out to my car and be positive or negative about my reflection. So I can get out to my car and go, how'd I go today in that workshop? Yeah, it's pretty good, and drive off, and nothing happens. I can reflect negatively. I could get out to the workshop and go, how did I go in that workshop today? I sucked. I was terrible. And still that doesn't drive action. What we need to do if we're going to have our reflection drive action to be genuinely insightful is we need to have a model that drives the way that we work. Mine is a firm and fair model. I believe as an educator that the very best teachers we had when we were kids were probably firm and fair. And so my determination is to be both firm and fair. I believe that when I do that, I work with the people that I'm in workshops with. I believe that when I get too firm and not fair enough, I do things to people in workshops. I smash them with really tough concepts, and whether they're enjoying it or whether they're intimidated by it or not, I keep plowing on and I hit them with some tough stuff and I say, this is what you need to make a difference. I believe that when I am too supportive in learning environments, when I'm too big on the fair but low on the firm, I'm doing things for them. I'm accepting some answers, going, yes, I completely understand what that means. In my head, I'm going, that's completely wrong, but I don't challenge it. The level of challenge and boundary is too fluffy and loose. And I believe that when I'm being neither firm nor fair, I'm not doing anything at all. So I have those 4 words that drive my work. I'm either not doing anything. I'm either doing things for people, I'm either doing things to people, or I'm doing things with people. It's a really useful model for me to think of when I get out to my car to do my reflection. And I go, I reckon I drifted across into this box today. If I made this adjustment, I would be able to genuinely say I was back in the with box, which is the target of my reflection. That insight then is guided. That insight then is guided by some principles that I've agreed on for myself previous to getting into that workshop. So I really want to encourage you that the use of foresight to hypothesize and the use of insight to reflect are 2 things that your people are genuinely going to need if they want to be successful in the future. And the final work skill is the ability to be able to summarize. If I were to return to where I began and spoke a little about Google searches and the huge volume of information that can become available to you, I think that really effective leaders and I think that really effective team members are capable of being able to shine a light on what really matters within that. I have an exceedingly clever friend called Linda who has just finished her PhD. And her PhD was on a scabies mite that exists in Australia and infects both people and animals, and how that could be countered in the future. And we had a little party to congratulate her on finishing her thesis, and I asked her to bring it along, so I wanted to have a look, and she handed it to me and she just said, you probably shouldn't bother. and I thought, oh, I'm horribly insulted by Linda there. When I flicked open the first page, I realised that she was completely right. There was no way that I could immerse myself in this incredible body of work that was hundreds of pages long and have any idea what it was all about. So Linda told me that I should flick to the conclusion. She was right. Not only did I have, and to be really honest, my understanding when I read the conclusion of her thesis was only slightly better than when I was trying to read the body of her thesis. It was so technical I couldn't get it, but she was able to work me through some of the key points in there and to help me to understand it. She was the one that was able to shine a light on the parts that I could access. And that's that ability to summarise. We teach kids in schools that their ability to write is dependent on the number one skill in being able to be a good writer is the ability to summarise and note take. And so note taking is still something that's an incredibly relevant skill. Why? Because the skill of writing is still incredibly relevant. Your people's ability to, as team members, to summarise, to note take, to write, to author pieces of work will allow you to capture their intellectual property for your business into the future. We know that they're not likely to hang around for long. they're going to, they're going to head off and they're going to, do wonderful things with their lives, which is great. But they're probably not going to stay in your organisation for 3 decades the way that people used to. But if we can make their work authored, what happens is that their learning becomes explicit. The learning and their knowledge becomes accessible for other people when they're able to author that work and able to leave it in your organisation after they leave. So the ability to write, the ability to summarise, the ability to note take is still an incredibly important skill. I would actually contend that it's the most ancient skill of my 10 future skills. And it's the one that will stand the test of time. So that ability to summarise is incredibly important. Okay, there's my 10 skills. I hope that's something that stands out for you as being useful. I'd like you to leave with a couple of possibilities. Number one is that what I'd love to do is to provide you with the slide deck from today. So if you have enjoyed today and would like to be able to reference some of those, really, because I guess to end at the beginning, want to acknowledge that they're broad skills, and beneath them is some very specific behaviours and actions. And if you'd like to reflect further on how you can get those happening with your team, then I really want to encourage you to head to the handout section on your control panel for GoToWebinar and download that slide deck before we do finish up today. I also want to acknowledge that if you're looking to work with us, that you can contact us. I'll put my details up as the very last slide. But if you'd like to chat further about some of the things that I've presented to you today, I'm really happy to do that for you. So just put the word chat in the question box or the chat box today, and we'll follow up by flicking you an email and making a time for us to just have a good old Australian yarn about some of those key concepts that I've presented to you today. Hey, our next webinar, we're going to return to our usual time of 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and this time we're going deep. So this is about how you can step beyond superficial learning, and superficial learning for me is the sort of learning that changes nothing. So you might know something, but you don't do anything with it. You don't create anything new with it. You don't do what my wonderful prep teachers did in my primary school, of create something that was unforeseen, what the great Shigata Mitra would call emergent phenomena. And that for me is an example of people who are capable of doing some deep thinking. And I want to give you some of the skills, some of the tips, some of the techniques, some of the strategies that encourage genuine deep learning. And I think you'll really enjoy it, because I guess for me, when we think about thinking and do that little bit of metacognition, the thinking that we actually really like doing is the deep stuff. It's harder. There's a lot of pressure on us. If you think about that example of a diver, when you go deep, the water pressure increases, but there's a thrill associated with it that you don't get when you learn superficially. So I want to give you some of the tips and tricks to be able to do it yourself, but also how to impart some of that ability to think deeply and to learn deeply with your people as well. So that will run, that one on the 19th of July at 2 p.m. That's if you're on the eastern seaboard in Australia. And if you're not, make the necessary adjustments as you register. There's the contact details, guys, if you would like to get in touch about how about some of these concepts, or more broadly about the work that we do through Real Learners. And I just want to thank you and congratulate you once more for your time today. I hope that the presentation of this work has been something that can make a difference for you and in your work. And have a wonderful Thursday. I'll talk to you all soon.